Super. So our second speaker is Alex Kaye. You're a second-year maths student, and yeah, you're studying climate change and how that's going to affect our diseases. So please tell us.
Thank you very much, Jack. So yeah, my name's Alex, and I'm supervised by Robin Thompson and Mike Tilsley, and my work is predominantly on climate change and vector-borne disease. So this graphic shows the warming stripes, and on the far left of this plot is the year 1850. On the far right is the year 2017, and dark blue shows an average temperature that's far below, and a kind of a more vivid red shows a temperature that's far above the average. And so you can see that in the past couple of decades, we've seen a large increase in the average temperature across the globe. And this has many secondary effects. So for example, climate refugees are becoming a thing where people are having to move out where they live because of severe droughts or flooding. But I'm particularly interested in the application of this to epidemiology. So mosquitoes carry lots of pathogens, I'm sure you know. So when I say mosquitoes here, I mean Aedes aegypti, and when I say pathogen, I'm talking about dengue. So currently dengue is fairly endemic around the equator, so maybe think Singapore, where the temperatures are quite hot. And so these vectors are quite picky about where exactly it is they live. And this is because if things get too hot, their proteins start to denature and they'll die. And if things get too cold, similarly, they'll die. But also the amount of rainfall matters in these mosquitoes' survivability. So if there's too much rainfall, these puddles where the mosquitoes lay their eggs, their young will be washed away with too much rainfall. And if there's not enough rainfall at all, then these puddles can't exist in the first place. And so there's this sweet spot in temperature and rainfall parameter space where these mosquitoes can thrive. And consequently, there's a sweet spot in that temperature rainfall parameter space where they can transmit diseases. Okay, so I apologize for the puns scattered throughout. This is a short part of a longer presentation, which has far more puns. This is the model for the mosquitoes. So I split it up into eggs, aquatic, and mobile. And I'm kind of siphoning off males because the males don't bite and so they can't transmit diseases. And so this is a fairly standard compartmental model where we've got some birth rate A and then some development rate from eggs to aquatic and B. But there's also a death rate going out of this BE class, which is given by B over K times AE, where K is some sort of carrying capacity. And so you can see that if A equals 0, there's no death rate out of this BE, and so all the individuals manage to survive. But if A is equal to the carrying capacity K, then the rate out is equal to the rate through, and so every individual that passes through dies immediately. And this K is going to be rainfall dependent. That's what dictates the carrying capacity. And I should note that most of these parameters will be temperature dependent. And then we've got the aquatic stage where there's a flush out, which I've called C, and a natural death rate D. And then half the individuals move to be mobile females and half of them go to be males. And then there's, again, some natural death rate G out of the mobile female class. Okay, so in parameterizing the model, there's some lab data sets where they essentially control the temperature and then they examine the different mosquito responses. So for example, A is the birth rate on the top left. I haven't showed the data, but there's these discrete data points at different temperatures and then the value of the birth rate. And I've done MCMC to fit what's called a Briere curve to that. So a Briere curve is this left skewed kind of what looks a bit like a quadratic. An interesting biologists have found that most mosquito responses will follow this Briere curve. And so this really does seem the most sensible thing to be fitting. But we get this kind of this behavior that makes sense where if things get too hot or too cold, the mosquitoes don't give birth anymore. And there's this optimum right in the middle, which I think is about 30 degrees in that case. And I've got similar data, but for different parameters. And these parameters all feed into the mosquito model. And those are the top 4 plots. Those are all the temperature dependent things. And then the bottom 2 plots here, the bottom left one shows carrying capacity K. And this increases with rainfall, which is what you'd expect. And then there's a paper by Silver et al., which considers static carrying capacity, and it lines up quite well at reasonable rainfall values. And so the carrying capacity that I'm predicting is certainly of the correct order of magnitude. But the derivation of the carrying capacity comes from looking at flow rates in and out of puddles, and then transforming volumes of areas. And then finally, C is the larval flush out. and that increases with rainfall. So the rainfall dependent parameters are perhaps the least rigorous part of the model, because there's not a huge amount of data out there about exactly how these mosquitoes respond to the different rainfalls. So I've had to do some inference. I've tried to keep uncertainty small on these parameters since we don't really know kind of much about them. Just trying to keep things simple. And then you can compute the steady state of the system. This assumes the quasi-steady state approximation, namely that the mosquito life cycle is quick compared to that of the humans. And this is okay in this case because the data that I'm getting is monthly data. So don't worry too much about the maths. The most important bit is this M star, which is the mosquito model, and its dependence on 1 minus Q naught. And so if you've done any bifurcation theory, maybe you can see that Q naught is a bifurcation parameter, and it flips stabilities at Q naught equals 1. So if Q naught is bigger than 1, then M star becomes negative, and the trivial population of all 0 mosquitoes becomes stable. And if Q naught is less than 1, then we're in this stable steady state M star. And so from this, we can plot an ecological niche. And so this is an area in rainfall and temperature parameter space. And the boundary of this region is going to be where Q naught equals 1. But because we've got some sort of uncertainty regarding the responses to the different temperatures, there's also uncertainty in the exact ecological niche. And so this middle plot, I could really do a laser pointer, but actually, can you see my, there we go. That kind of middle plot there. That shows where we most expect mosquitoes to live. This is like a 50th percentile. And then I've plotted different points on top of this, where the black points correspond to known Aedes aegypti populations, and the red points are known dengue outbreaks. And these use temperature and rainfall conditions that are averaged over quite a long period of time, which is why a lot of them are further to the south of this graph, because the kind of the winter temperatures drag them down. Okay, but kind of the message here is that I've mechanistically derived an ecological niche where the mosquitoes are happy. Okay, so we can use climate data then to predict the suitability for Aedes aegypti, and this is 2020. And I'm plotting here the number of months that are suitable for the mosquitoes across the globe. And this maybe looks how you might expect it, where there are only a couple of months far up north where they're suitable. So maybe you think the summer of the UK, they might be able to thrive for like 1 or 2 months. But that requires them to migrate here and then have a breeding population, which constantly requires lots and lots of suitable months back to back. So we're not really at risk up here. And this is 2060. And so you can see there's been a bit of northward movement, and also a bit of southward movement away from the Sahara Desert. And this is because things get too hot in the Sahara as the mosquitoes die from that. And then we can look at 2100 and say there's even more drastic northward movements. Right, it's even more drastic southward movements. And quite an interesting case study, I think, is Australia. So predominantly the only area at risk of dengue right now is Queensland, which is the northeast of Australia. And you can see this is exactly where the model is kind of the brightest. But moving forwards, you can see this area migrates and actually moves more to the southwest. And so we are seeing this kind of poleward shift of areas which are more suitable for Aedes aegypti and consequently more suitable for dengue transmission. And this is just a plot that shows the difference between the 2020 and the 2100 plots. And so I'm defining contraction as being, or an area becoming less suitable by a month or more in 2100 compared to 2020, and then expansion being a month or more of suitability. And so again, you can see sort of a poleward drift, and maybe around the equator, things get a bit less suitable. I should note that if things are less suitable around the equator, it's due to hot temperatures. And if it's too hot for mosquitoes, then it's almost certainly too hot for us as well. And so this isn't a good thing either. And then this is a plot that showed the, kind of the little black points on this plot come from a data set of Aedes aegypti populations compiled by Moritz Kramer. And most of the data is only available kind of around Brazil, but you can see there's quite a good match between, really you only see the black dots happening in the brighter yellow areas, which is comforting. I should note that my model gives necessary but not sufficient conditions for the mosquitoes to thrive. So namely, mosquito migration is required to that area in the first place for them to then set up a breeding population. So if we had more data about where exactly the vectors are, I suspect this would be more populated. I'm not sure how it would look, but certainly in kind of around Brazil, this model looks okay. Okay, so the climate data comes from the Community Earth System model, which is based over in the National Center of Atmospheric Research in Colorado, and it's provided by my external partner, Professor Jim Harrell. There are 100 different simulations of the Earth's atmosphere, and each of them are initialized early last millennium by you've got an atmospheric temperature field, and then you slightly perturb it in places and repeat this 100 times, and then run the simulations. And eventually these things diverge because the climate is a classic chaotic system. So when you start with nearby initial conditions, the solutions diverge fairly quickly. And I think maybe Ian Markham explains it best in Jurassic Park when he puts the water on the hand. So that's chaos theory. And this arises because of the initial conditions, but climate scientists call this natural climate variability. So this is kind of the variability we see in the climate that's not as a result of us doing things. So for example, greenhouse gases. And it is true that the climate goes through phases of getting hotter and colder naturally. But I should note that the last kind of 20 years or 30 years that we've seen huge increases in temperature are not due to natural climate variability. That's almost certainly anthropogenic climate variability, climate change. So kind of the end message is that it matters what simulation you pick, because it matters what initial conditions you use as to your results. And then a brief overview of natural climate variability in the way that I kind of understand it is that you can split Earth up into sea, land, and atmosphere. And then each of these things has various systems which all interact with one another. And so these arrows indicate an interaction. And these are just the tipping points. So tipping points are kind of systems that are set up such that they can go through positive feedback loops. And so, for example, a classic tipping point is the Western Antarctic ice sheet, where ice is white, right? And so it reflects light quite well. But the more the ice melts, the more kind of the less white it is and the more sea it exposes, which means it absorbs more heat. And so it's this positive feedback loop. And that interacts with other things. So for example, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which is this current that runs from kind of near Australia up northwards. But yeah, all these systems interact in quite complicated ways, which gives rise to this variability. And so this is just a plot of how we can maybe visualize natural climate variability. So I think maybe the top two plots are the most enlightening. And here I've just plotted the average temperature, or the change in average temperature between 2014 and 2020. And the top left plot is using one simulation, and the top right plot is using another. And these are both initialized using slightly different atmospheric temperature fields. And you can see that they are already vastly different. So if you just look at Greenland, it gets colder in the future using the top left simulation, but it gets hotter in the future using the top right simulation. And so this shows that natural climate variability and how we choose our initial conditions really matter. And the same is true for rainfall, but perhaps this is a bit less enlightening because it doesn't change that much. And you can perhaps see evidence of El Nino or La Nina events there. So this is a simulation I've chosen using one of the climate simulations, and I fed it through my model and come up with this prediction. And this is doing exactly the same thing, but this time for a different climate simulation. So these are perturbations in the initial conditions. And already you can see that these two things are quite different. And this is the plot of the difference between the two, where I've defined more suitable as being more suitable by a month or more for the mosquitoes. And so you can see this is really quite patchy, and we do see a lot of difference in the suitability. And so kind of quite a big result of what I'm working on currently is like how important is natural climate variability, and current evidence points towards it being very important indeed. And this is quite concerning because it's one of the only, I think it's the only source of uncertainty that we can't actually reduce in the system. So in this sort of modeling framework, there's three sorts of uncertainty. There's model uncertainty, which you can reduce by maybe getting better models, which is very difficult, but you can do it. And then there's parameter uncertainty, we can resolve by doing more experiments on mosquitoes. And then there's uncertainty in initial conditions, which is the natural climate variability. And that's impossible to resolve. The only way we can resolve this uncertainty is by moving closer to the time, at which point it might already be too late. Not to sound all doom and gloom, but so by the time we get to 2100, I've got a histogram of 100 different points which show how many months will be suitable for the mosquitoes at that time. And sort of the wider the distribution of this histogram, the more important natural climate variability is, and the narrower, the less important it is. And so I've just taken the maximum of this histogram and plotted it for each pixel here. And that's the minimum for each pixel. And this is the maximum. And you can see that these two plots are vastly different, which means that in general, these histograms we get at every single pixel, they're not just concentrated at one point, and in fact their distribution can be quite large, which points to the fact that natural climate variability is very important. But to characterize that better, you might be interested in the standard deviation. And so every single point I've computed the standard deviation of this histogram, and we get this plot here. And so I don't think there is anywhere that sees suitability for mosquitoes in 2100 that has a standard deviation equal to 0. And so this means that no matter where you are, you do see some sort of effect from natural climate variability. But there are some areas that see it much worse than others. So for example, Indonesia is that bright yellow patch there, and it shows the highest standard deviation. And this implies that depending on which climate scenario we're in, which simulation we use, they can either have many, many months suitable for mosquitoes in 2100, or they could barely have any. I currently think that this is because rainfall plays quite an important part in that area of the world. They get tropical storms, and I think some years they get very intense tropical storms, which reduces the capacity for mosquitoes. And other times or other years they might not get many at all, which means it's like a good mosquito breeding ground. Okay, and now I'll briefly talk about how I'm using these mosquito dynamics to talk about the spread of dengue. And so this is the disease transmission model. It's a standard Ross McDonald model using SIR compartments for humans and SEI compartments for mosquitoes. The reason there's no exposed class for humans is because that doesn't change the R0. So Phoebe mentioned what the R0 was before. That's the average number of people infected by a primary case in a susceptible population. Introducing an exposed class doesn't change the R0, and so I've just ignored that. And the assumption regarding ignoring the recovered compartment in mosquitoes is that when they get dengue, they're infected for life. So that's the model framework. And then similarly to before, I've got these lab experiments that measure things like the bite rate on the top left and maybe susceptibility to infection on the bottom two plots. And again, I've done some MCMC and fitted left skewed Briere curves. I should mention that a lot of this work is kind of based on what Ryan et al. Did. They use a similar approach where they just use a temperature dependent model. And I've kind of extended their methodology to include rainfall. Okay, and then you can use your favorite R0 calculation method. I like the next generation matrix method. That's a bit messy sometimes to come up with your value of R0. And R here means rainfall and capital T means temperature. And so the only rainfall dependent parameter that I've got in the R0 is M star, which is the equilibrium value of the mosquitoes. And then the rest are assumed to just be temperature dependent. Then N is the number of people. And I think at this point I was sick of uncertainty, and so I just set gamma, the recovery rate, equal to 1/5. And then you can plot a change in dengue transmission, where again, red indicates an expansion by a month or more, and blue indicates a contraction. And this is very similar to what we saw for the Aedes aegypti maps. And that makes a lot of sense because Aedes aegypti are the carriers for dengue. And so the conditions should be reflected from one to the other, right? But we don't actually see an increase in R0 in the UK, which is comforting, or we don't see an increase of R0 greater than 1. So we're not going to have sustained transmission. That's what R0 is kind of bigger than 1. So areas which do see an R0 bigger than 1, they should be a bit more concerned because this is where local sustained transmission can occur. Yeah. So conclusion, there is poleward expansion of areas that are suitable for this Aedes aegypti mosquito, but some areas become less suitable, which isn't good news for us either. Natural climate variability is important globally, but more important in some areas than others. And then some bonus conclusions, which I didn't have time to show the slides for. But I talked about variability being heavily driven by rainfall. I think this hints towards us needing a better understanding of how it is that Aedes aegypti respond to the rainfall. So we need more kind of lab experiments. I should also mention that lab experiments aren't ideal because mosquitoes don't behave that way in the real world. But it's quite hard to artificially change the temperature in a real world setting. And so it's difficult to get this data. Another interesting conclusion I had was, remember we saw an expansion and contraction. It turns out these expansion and contraction zones roughly cancel each other out. And so the population at risk remains roughly constant in the future with climate change. But if we account for kind of weighting this by R0, we see that generally transmission does get worse in areas which do experience more. And I managed to isolate the effect of population change from the effect of climate change. I found that population change is a larger contributor to the population at risk. And other people have found this as well. So this is interesting. So what next? I like to consider Aedes albopictus, which also carries dengue, but it's maybe thought to be the minority carrier. But it's more suitable to maybe European climate. And so I think its optimum temperature is around 26 degrees as opposed to 29 degrees for Aedes aegypti. And so if we are going to see any sort of vector-borne disease in this country, it would likely be from albopictus. I can also make potential improvements to the model. So I feel like the bite rate should be wind dependent. So if there's really, really windy conditions, I don't think the mosquitoes should be able to latch onto people and bite. So that's potential improvement. And I couldn't just not use the quasi-steady state approximation. And so just solve these ODEs manually or computationally. I'd also quite like to make an app. My current idea for an app would be you kind of put in where you live and it tells you across all the different climate simulations what time is the earliest that you might expect to see an outbreak or like a positive probability of seeing an outbreak of dengue. But I am open to discussing that idea with anybody. And then I'd quite like to move to a smaller spatial scale. So the problem with the climate data I've got currently is because it was generated in such a large ensemble of 100 different members, it's in 100 kilometers by 100 kilometer grids, and it's quite hard to make meaningful predictions when the climate data is that coarse. And so I'm currently looking at outbreaks in northeast Italy of dengue, chikungunya, and Zika carried by Aedes albopictus. Yeah, and in general, I'm just quite interested in seasonality, and I'd like more climate data. Thank you very much.